All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the first of a series of kickoff events leading towards the YCEI annual conference. It's going to take place on April 9th in the Yale School of Law. And it's a conference you have to register for, so please do so. And you can link that webpage under www.climate.yale.edu. We're having two more events coming up. The second one taking place on March 23rd at this very place. And we're going to have three engineering and science students battling out the best technology to solve the energy challenges that we're facing. So they're going to talk about battery technologies, about solar fuels, and then also about genomics and biofuels. And then on March 30th, we're going to have professors, Yale professors, to talk about similar topics. And that's all going to be announced on the webpage of the YCEI. Today, though, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rajendra Pachauri. He obviously doesn't need much of an introduction. I'd like to highlight some of his position achievements, however. Dr. Pachauri is the chief executive of TERI, the Energy and Research Institute, and he's also the chairman of the Ipcc. And in that position, he won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, together with Al Gore. Dr. Pachauri has and is associated with many research institutes and academic institutes, including Yale University. And he first came to Yale actually in 2000 as a McCluskey Fellow, teaching at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And he returned. So in 2009, he joined the Yale Climate and Energy Institute as a director. And the YCEI is a faculty initiative supported by President Levin to put Yale on the map of climate and energy research and policy. And last year, we held, the YCEI held its inaugural conference. And this year's conference is coming up, as I mentioned, very soon, and its title is Technological Innovation for an Energy Secure Future. So now, without further ado, I'd like to give the stage to Dr. Rajendra Pachauri.
Thanks, Tina. Thank you.
I think you left.
Yeah, no, I was shaking your hand.
Oh.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I want to say that we place a great deal of importance on this conference because this is going to be an annual event which would not only provide an opportunity for the rest of the world to get to know what the Yale Climate and Energy Institute is, but for us to be able to make a contribution in terms of providing some directions, some perspectives, and some priorities on what needs to be done. I need hardly mention that the whole area of energy and climate is something that's in an extremely dynamic and a critical stage, because obviously what has worked in the past is not going to work in the future. But it's important for us to see which directions we might move in to be able to ensure that the 7 billion people on this planet are able to live in a situation of security, in a situation where their very basic needs can be met. And how you define basic needs is in itself a great challenge. Let me go back historically to something which, in retrospect, now seems like a failure on the part of analysts and those dealing with economic policy to identify something that's really of crucial importance, not only to today's economic growth and development, but what would happen in the future, and to economic welfare and progress as a whole. If you look at what economics taught you about growth and development. I wonder if that's my telephone. Let me switch it off. I'll put it away in my pocket. Yeah. I think the main emphasis in economic models of growth and development has been on looking at capital and labor as the two major inputs. And the very theme of this conference is something that was not thought of explicitly because we excluded technology and we excluded energy. Growth was seen to be driven essentially by these two sets of inputs, capital and labor. And the models that were developed to quantify this relationship looked at output as a function of the inputs of capital as well as labor. Now this incidentally changed substantially, particularly after the first oil price shock of 1973-74 and the subsequent one, the second one in 1979-80. I think suddenly the world woke up and the economics profession woke up to see that clearly there was an extremely important element of inputs that are essential to bringing about growth and development and which they had neglected in the past. Now, up to that stage, technology certainly had come to be regarded as an important driver of growth and development. And there are several people who actually, there was Denison who went into quantification of the contribution of technology to growth and development by looking at the contributions of capital and labor and treating the residual as something that must have come from technological change. And several other researchers did the same thing. I'm mentioning this only because if one looks at tradition, energy and technology have really not been given the explicit place that they deserve in understanding what contributes to economic output. Now that's one issue that I think we need to understand. The second issue that we need to understand is the need to see how security is linked with the availability and supply of energy. Because today's economic engine is entirely dependent on fossil fuels. And we know that over a period of time, at least one form of fossil fuels, that's oil in particular, is getting increasingly dependent on supplies from a very limited region of the world. And that raises issues of supply. I mean, we know what's happening today. With all the trouble that's taking place in Libya, for instance, there's been a sudden impact on global oil prices. And where this will end, one doesn't know. Because if you're going to depend on a small region which is going to supply the bulk and certainly the increasing share of oil in the future, then geopolitical factors become an extremely important determinant of the security of supply on a global level. But there's also another important area that we have not focused on in the past, and that is the whole issue of energy scarcity. There are a large number of people on this globe today, in the year 2011, who have no access to what we regard as modern fuels, modern forms of energy, and what we take completely for granted. There's anywhere a number close to 1.5 billion people, 1.5 billion people, it could be 1.4 to 1.6, who have no access to electricity. And well over 2 billion people are dependent, for cooking at least, and for creating heat for a variety of purposes for their well-being and existence, on biomass resources. And with the scarcity of biomass increasing, the kind of fuels that they are using today are becoming progressively inferior. So therefore, there's a large share of the human population today that clearly does not have proper or reliable supply of energy. And I think the security of supply for that section of the human race is also an extremely important issue that we have not dealt with so far. Now, to compound this situation and the uncertainties that we see in the supply of oil in particular and the price of oil that would be ruling trade in the future, we really need to see what are the major drivers by which energy decisions are going to be taking place. Firstly, of course, we know that as far as oil supply is concerned, we have a cartel of sorts, OPEC, although I had analyzed this in considerable detail and I came to the conclusion that OPEC is not really a cartel. A cartel is something where generally suppliers have an equal amount of power. But this is what in economics is regarded as a dominant firm supply system. And here, the dominant firm is really Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is the largest supplier of oil. And if you've been reading the newspapers, you would have noticed that in view of the decline in production in Libya, Saudi Arabia has already committed that it's going to increase and enhance its supply of oil, because they still have a certain amount of surplus capacity which they can turn on whenever the need arises, whenever they feel that prices need to be moderated or supplies have to be increased. So it's, in a sense, not strictly a cartel, but it's a grouping of suppliers where you've got one dominant supplier, and that's Saudi Arabia. And therefore, to a large extent, the decisions that are taken in OPEC are the result of positions taken by Saudi Arabia. Not entirely, but to a large extent. So if we look at the future of energy supply, then how OPEC is going to behave is going to be an extremely important driver. What is even more important is the manner in which demand is going to continue to grow. There are two sides of the oil market, and for the moment I'm only focusing on the oil market. There is a supply side where today we know that there really hasn't been a major accretion of reserves by which we can be assured that whatever is the increase in demand, supply will respond to be able to provide the quantities that are demanded. But there is, of course, the demand side. And there, I think we have got into a structural reality whereby the manner in which we use oil and energy in general is essentially dependent on technologies that we have developed. I mean, one single technology which I think is very important for the supply of liquid fuels, of oil, is the technology of the motor vehicle. Now, we are so dependent on this, we are so used to the use of this particular technology that to shift away from it is going to be extremely difficult. Then we also know there's a whole range of other uses, end uses, where we are essentially dictated by technologies and infrastructure that cannot be changed overnight. And this is what brings about some degree of uncertainty and therefore a questioning of the security of supply in the future. But if we want to ensure that there is a smooth and affordable supply of energy in the future, then we will have to make interventions on both sides. Those interventions will have to be on the demand side. And if you look at oil as a source of energy, then clearly transportation is the one sector which is highly dependent on the use of oil. Because the infrastructure that we have created, including roads, highways, the entire automobile industry is such that we cannot change it overnight. We can bring about incremental changes, and those incremental changes will have to come about rather rapidly. But we really cannot bring about a wholesale changeover to something new, a new set of infrastructure. So this, to my mind, is something that policymakers have to take into account, but we must also accept the fact that any effort to change, no matter how rational and desirable it might be, is going to be resisted by those who see a decline in their own business opportunities. And this certainly includes the automobile industry, it includes the highway industry, it includes the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not too sure whether democracy gives us the elbow room by which we can bring about the changes rapidly enough. And therefore, unfortunately, it may be a very unfortunate, it may be something that is not something that one would advocate, but there may have to be some disruptions by which we are jolted into taking decisions that might be to the long-term benefit of humanity. And such a jolt could easily come from an increase in oil prices to, say, $150 a barrel. It could also come from some geopolitical problem as a result of which physical supplies of oil could be limited. But overall, I think what we really need to do is to bring about a clear projection of where we are going, and then identify interventions by which we can bring about a shift to a much more secure future. And to bring this about, we would necessarily need technologies, and therefore research and development strategies by which new technologies can be developed or the existing ones be improved. But more than that, we would also need to restructure some of our institutions by which decisions are taken in the right direction. And I'll say a little more on that in a while. But to complicate all of this is also the reality of climate change. We realize across the globe that we have to now reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. And the bulk of these emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels. Therefore, we would need technologies by which we can bring about a shift to other sources of energy, away from dependence on fossil fuels. We would also need to invest in research and development, whereby we can create viable, economically viable solutions to give us the reality of supply from some of these alternative sources. And most importantly, we need efforts, including research and development, for ensuring much more efficient use of energy, even when it comes to the use of fossil fuels. Now, in the case of climate change, in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence. And it was intended that as part of this framework convention, and it was deliberately called a framework convention because it was not really in the nature of an agreement that bound different countries or different societies to certain actions. But it was envisaged that under this framework, an agreement would be developed under which most countries of the world will have to be committed to reducing their emissions of greenhouse gases. So that's how the Kyoto Protocol came into existence, which was in 1997. But the requirements for this protocol to become internationally legal, certain number of countries had to ratify the protocol. This included the United States, it included Australia, and both of these countries refused to ratify the protocol. So then it fell on Russia as the last country to ratify it, because the requirement was that it must be a certain number of countries and they must account for a certain percentage of the overall global emissions of greenhouse gases. And it was Russia which basically filled the gap to meet these conditions. And Russia decided to ratify this in 2004, and 6 months later the Kyoto Protocol came into legal existence. But what is even worse, quite apart from this enormous delay in getting an agreement in place, is the fact that even those countries which have ratified the protocol have not really stuck by its provisions, and they have not met the commitments which they had signed on to. So therefore, the effort thus far has been very feeble, and there is now an ongoing set of negotiations by which it is expected that a new set of commitments will come into existence after 2012, which is the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And these negotiations have really not gone all that well, because it was intended that the Conference of the Parties in 2009, which took place in Copenhagen, would be the point at which the world would come to an agreement which would be binding, and by which we would start reducing emissions of greenhouse gases on a programmed and committed basis. That didn't happen. The Cancun Conference of the Parties, which took place just a couple of months ago, certainly provided, 3 months ago, provided some hope, because some fairly concrete directions have been set, and all of this translates into actions by which energy use will have to change, and it will have to move away from the use of fossil fuels. So where we are at this point of time is not very certain, because much depends on the following Conference of the Parties. The next one will take place in Durban, and whether we would be in a position to arrive at an agreement by which emissions of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide in particular can be reduced. So I wanted to highlight the fact that we're at a juncture of uncertainty at this point of time. And therefore, it is particularly important for us to get together some of the best minds, those from the field of science, technology, policy making, because each one of these will have to mesh together to give us an energy future that is secure. And there is a role for each of these elements to play on an urgent and meaningful basis. Now, if we don't have proper policies, such as placing a price on carbon, there's really no incentive for producers as well as consumers of energy to move towards low carbon fuels and low carbon products that would bring about a reduction in emissions. If science is not going to deliver solutions which are really out of the box and that can become game changers, then obviously there is very little hope of bringing about a radical shift in the structure of supply of energy and the consumption in various sectors of the economy. And technology, the engineering disciplines have an extremely important role to play, because they have to translate scientific discoveries, scientific promise into technological reality. And this conference, in my view, is coming at a stage when, as you know, the kind of motivation for acting to deal with the challenge of climate change, at least in this country, is at a low. And if we can come up with solutions then and disseminate them effectively, then we hope we can influence society in this country and elsewhere. Now, before I stop, I wanted to highlight another aspect of the solutions that we must be dealing with. To reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, we certainly have to devise policies by which we provide incentives as well as disincentives to all the players in any society. But we must also remember that the future of energy supply has in the end to become much more secure. So there's going to be a transition. It's not something which requires us the throw of a switch to bring about a shift. And I think at every stage of the plan that we develop for the future, we'll have to see how lifestyle changes, how the induction of new technology, how scientific research and development might make a contribution by which we move to a desired end point. And one important reason why I think we need to look at this entire scenario with a sense of urgency is because there are huge benefits from reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, those being a much more secure energy future, and also reducing the level of air pollution at the local level, because air pollution, both indoor and outdoor, is a major killer in several parts of the world. One important area that unfortunately never gets global attention is what I referred to earlier, the problem of energy security for some of the poorest people in the world. Now, when they burn poor quality fossil fuel, poor quality biomass, then there's a huge amount of pollution that takes place. And often this is in a confined space because people who burn these biomass fuels are living in homes that are really very meager. They have very poor ventilation in several cases. So women and children in particular take in large quantities of noxious fumes. And this leads to very widespread upper respiratory diseases, which create morbidity, of course, but also a large level of mortality. So to move to an energy secure future for this section of society is also attendant on improvements in health as a result of lowering of air pollution. Another great benefit of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and finding green solutions, secure solutions for energy supply is the fact that agricultural productivity would be much higher. Climate change is already showing impacts on agricultural yields which are largely unfavorable. And finally, if you go back to the whole understanding of the economic structure of society today, then in several respects, we have reached a kind of a plateau. If you look at the developed countries, much of the manufacturing has moved to other parts of the world. And therefore, if you have to restart the engine of growth, you really don't have too many sectors where you can bring about a major improvement and increase in economic activity. Now, one means by which we can bring about a regeneration of employment and therefore economic welfare would be to create these new sectors of energy supply, creating energy efficiency, because all of this will generate per unit a much higher level of employment than if we were to continue on the conventional path. So for all these reasons, I think it's critically important for us to look at technological solutions and see how a coalition of different stakeholders can bring about a major shift in technological innovation and its use so that we can create a much more secure energy future. So what I've said is really general. I've just tried to give you an overview of the global problem of energy security or the lack of it, an overview of the opportunities that we are faced with, and also the fact that there is need for us to bring about some rapid changes. And if we don't seize the moment, then clearly the impacts of climate change are going to be rather disastrous, not only for generations to come, but even for the generation that's living on this planet today. So I'll be very happy to answer any questions and any specific points that you wish to be clarified. I'll try to do the best I can. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri, for this introduction to the conference topic. So as he said, he would like to take some questions. I have the mic here. I'll give it over.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
So within the U.S., there's been a failure to move forward with any sort of economic signal, any sort of price signal, and it looks like it might be a few years before that opportunity presents itself again. There are folks who are focusing just on the need to facilitate innovation. What do you see as a path forward within the U.S. That can get us where we need to go quickly enough if a price signal in any form is not an option, at least in the near term?
You know, if I was a policymaker, I would make the argument of energy security. And I think this is something that would go down well with the population over here because, you know, it's not all that long ago that you had the two oil price shocks. And today, with the situation that you have in Libya and other countries, and God knows what will happen next, people would be concerned about this huge dependence on oil imports as far as this country is concerned. The world today produces a little in excess of 80 million barrels of oil a day, and almost 20 million barrels a day are being consumed in this country. So anything that happens to the global oil market has a disproportionately large impact on this country, largely because this is a disproportionately large consumer of oil. So I would make the argument that we have to move to a more secure energy future. And therefore, to bring that about, these are the actions that people have to take. And that would include certainly investments in public transport. And I know that's not going to be easy politically. It would certainly include tighter standards on efficiency of fuels in automobiles, perhaps regulation of energy use in buildings, which incidentally pays for itself, hands down, because it's an extremely attractive area for bringing about technological interventions, both for new buildings where the scope is enormous, but also for retrofits. So I think these are some of the arguments and messages that leaders in this country must start putting out. You take the example of California, which has been ahead of everybody else when it comes to a sustainable energy future. Of course, one reason I was told is that California is not a major producer of energy, and therefore it's been politically easy to do that. But not every state in this country is an energy producer. So let's at least start with the states where there is no vested interest in the form of supply industry for energy. So I think we need to shift the focus of the message, and hopefully that will bring about change.
Hi, you mentioned that, just quickly in passing, that democratic institutions might not be well set up to handle the scope of this problem. Other than the obvious argument that, you know, it's easier to evoke technological change in a place like China or something like that. What could you flesh that out a little bit, and maybe what's the solution if that's the problem?
No, I didn't mean that there's a flaw in democratic institutions. I was thinking of, you know, like the role and the powers of an organization like the EPA. Now, the EPA certainly has the mandate to reduce or at least require a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases But from the interaction that we've had with them, they're not really well prepared. And I think we need to link them with institutions like this and other systems whereby they get inputs. I feel they should also be far more proactive in spreading information to the public. I mean, the EPA is regarded as a kind of, if I can be candid, as a kind of an evil threat to society because they're going to curb people's rights to do what they should be allowed to do. But as I mentioned a little earlier, in spreading the message about energy security and how to ensure it, I think organizations like the EPA can play an extremely important role. They must have a public information program so that people realize that this organization is really doing something for our good and the good of our children and grandchildren. The other thing that I believe is required is to create a platform where industry, government, civil society, academia can come together. Because this is a problem that's not going to be solved by any single set of actors. We need all stakeholders to get involved. And thus far, industry has really been sulking in this area. They haven't really shown the kind of enthusiasm to solve not just a national problem, but an international problem of huge dimensions. So we need to create some of these institutions. And I just wonder if the president can set up a platform where these things are debated and discussed. And we should sort of enliven the discussion that is taking place. At the moment, you get voices coming out of the darkness, attacking one or the other element of what is being proposed. I think you need a much more open and a much more vigorous and a better informed debate. I don't see a platform at this point of time where that is happening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri. We're now, IPCC is working on the 5th assessment report. I just wonder if you can comment on, I guess, what's the progress of it, and what do you think will be a big difference from the 4th one? Thank you.
Well, we are in the early stages of preparing the 5th assessment report. We've had 2 sets of lead author meetings. There are 3 working groups. 2 of them have kicked off their work. The 3rd one will be doing that very soon. But in addition to the 5th assessment report, we're also bringing out 2 special reports. In May, we complete a special report on renewable energy. And in November of this year, we'll have a report on extreme events, where people will hopefully be able to understand the link between climate change and the occurrence, frequency, intensity of extreme events. So as far as the 5th assessment report is concerned, we certainly will have much more knowledge because in the past few years there's been much more research and therefore a substantial increase in publications activity. Now that also increases the burden on the authors who are going to write the report, because just to give you a number, in the 4th assessment report there were roughly 18,000 published sources of material that we had to study and assess. This time around, it could be three times that number. So, I mean, I'm glad I'm not an author. Anyway, I get a lot of flack for being chairman of the IPCC, but being an author would only add a little more to that, because you would have to study a lot, and you'll have to be very careful in interpreting all the material that you study. It's a pretty daunting task. However, I think with this increase in knowledge which has taken place, I imagine we'll be able to sort of bridge some of the gaps that exist currently. We're also looking at some new subjects. We're certainly going to provide much greater regional detail on the impacts of climate change, and I hope we succeed in doing that. We're going to look at the role of aerosols and cloud cover in understanding how much of a role they play in bringing about climate change. We're going to look at ethics, equity issues, and there'll be a much greater emphasis on some of the economic and socio-political aspects of what needs to be done. So there are quite a few new topics that we have included. Not that these were not there earlier, but since we have identified them explicitly and we are going to place much greater emphasis on them, I expect we'll have a lot more information this time around on some of these subjects.
There's 2 more questions here, but I'm just going to abuse my power right now and ask a question myself. Picking up on the research topic, we're always talking about technological innovation and like these major breakthroughs. Being a scientist at an accredited university here, I'm very much aware about like the costs of research and how much it takes to come forward with great ideas and follow them through. So I would be interested what your take is on where funding money for those ideas and technologies will be coming from and how we can increase these funds.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I would see funding being stepped up, or I'd like to see it being stepped up in 2 areas. One is on the pure science itself, where clearly the certainty associated with reaching any level of success is not very high. Now that's an area where government has to provide funding. And we know from past experience, wherever governments have taken a lot of initiative and have shown some vision in providing adequate funding, the benefits to society have been enormous. You take the case of the space program. At the time when President Kennedy said that we'll land a person on the moon, everybody thought that this is only a satisfaction of national ego. But it just led to the development of a new industry, a new area of knowledge, which has had so many spillover effects. I mean, as a result of space technology, you know now where your water resources are. You can carry out a mapping of so many extremely important pieces of information that have transformed our lives, and we have taken them for granted. And I imagine in this entire space of energy, environment, climate change, governments have the primary role for funding the scientific aspects of research. Now, if you look at the technology part, then this is where, yes, governments can come in to some extent, but I think the bulk of the effort and funding has to come from industry. But here again, government has a role because government must provide the right signals. I mean, for instance, I'm not saying that we get rid of the motor cars that are being produced today, but government can clearly lay down a roadmap to say, okay, if efficiency and fuel standards are X at this point of time, in the next 5 years, they must rise to 2X. And the years after that, next 10 years, they must rise to so and so. Otherwise, there'll be certain penalties that are imposed. Now, that would induce, in a sense, that's providing a price on carbon. And that would induce industry to move in a particular direction. So here again, where we expect industry to provide most of the funding to bring about technological change, there is clearly a role for governments and society at large. So I think this is where we somehow need to create the platform that I was talking about. And I hope a conference like ours would be a useful starting point to look at some of these elements of what policy should be, what industry should be looking at, because often industry has a very short-term myopic view of benefits in terms of profits and profitability. They have to start looking beyond, because we're living in a globalized world. And everybody in the future is going to move to a low carbon economy. And those industries that don't wake up to that fact are the ones who are going to be left behind. So we have to somehow induce that kind of thinking in the leadership of industry. Some of them are already doing it, but there's a large number that need to be sensitized to this reality.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned the 2 billion people that don't have access to adequate forms of energy, but in a country like India, the increase in emissions and consumption is really driven by the urbanizing middle portions of the society classes. So I was wondering if you could comment on how that pattern could be addressed in terms of whether broader macroeconomic and social policy versus technology, and how we can address that, change that particular class, maybe with respect to India in particular.
Well, there are two dimensions that we need to look at. Certainly the urban problem, where unfortunately those who are rising to the level of the upper middle class are trying to emulate patterns that you have in the developed world. And that, I suppose, is understandable, because you can't have two standards governing behavior of human beings in different parts of the globe. But I think we have to realize the benefits from a different path of development as far as a country like India is concerned. We cannot possibly consume resources on a per capita basis as the developed world has been consuming, simply because we'll run out of those resources. We won't be able to afford them. But then there's the other problem of the rural areas. And here I was going to show you a 3-minute film. We need to ensure that technological change touches the lives of people who are completely out of this system at this point of time. And it is with this in view that we've launched this program called Lighting a Million Lives. And I wonder if this is the appropriate stage when I could play the video. I wouldn't know how to do it. So you basically need technology not only in terms of coming up with solutions that are cost effective, that are technologically viable, but also one needs means by which you can spread these innovations. And I think given the fact that as far as the poor people in the world are concerned, you're really starting from scratch. You therefore have an opportunity to bring about change which is really radical. And I think there's also a wealth of humanitarian reasons why we need to focus on that section of society. The world, and I would say national governments, have just not focused on these underprivileged people so far, at least.